Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlinn
And Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos.
And most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Welcome to the Mything Link. This week
the Mything Link.
This week we're talking about the Furies. The Furies. And content disclaimer, today we will be talking about themes of violence, vengeance, retribution, death, and blood. As far as our episodes have gone so far, this is a pretty tame one in comparison. When discussing the Furies, we will be looking at their portrayal in both Greek and Roman literature, their function in mythology, and their role in the show Chaos. We'll also be talking about the different names used to refer to these creatures that we know as the Furies and where those names come from and their significance. Now, quick note, we are pretty particular around these parts about using the Greek names and not the Roman names. The Furies are an interesting exception. So I just want to put that out there right away, that Furies is the Latin Roman name. And it's also the name that they're choosing to use in Chaos. They're calling them the Furies. And that's traditionally how they're known in English as well. So we'll go into the etymology of everything as the episode continues. But I just want to put that little disclaimer.
The names in Greek are interesting and also multiplicitous, which is...
Right. But we'll get into that. So in Chaos, there are 3 Furies. Their names are Alecto, who's played by Kathy Tyson, Meg, who's played by Natalie Clamar, and TC, who's played by Donna Banya. The Furies have a really fun function within Greek and Roman mythology. They're seen as the personification of curses.
So to clarify what we mean by personification is when we portray abstract concepts, ideas, or other non-human things as people. So like how Aphrodite is the concept of love portrayed as a woman, she is love and sexuality personified in a divine/human form. Doing this allows us to identify with the concepts in a more personal and concrete way.
The Furies, as personifications of curses against criminals, had a pretty specific function to punish mortals, and they lived in the underworld and would come up to Earth as needed to pursue criminals. And they also oversaw the torture of criminals down in Tartarus, in the underworld. And we'll go into Tartarus in more detail in our next episode. So make sure to tune back in next week.
The Furies are often depicted wielding torches, scourges made of scorpions, and spears.
What's a scourge? What's a scourge?
It's like a stick with like a string of weaponry on It's like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, it's like a whip. It's like a whip.
It's like a whip, but with multiple whips. It's like one handle, multiple strings. Oftentimes there was things like nails or glass or metal or stone tied into those extra whips to cause more pain. These are the weapons of vengeance as they pursued the wicked and those who wrongly shed blood on the mortal realm.
Mm. And what's really, really cool about what Chaos did is in Chaos, the Furies are depicted as a biker gang delivering justice, and they're like these badass ladies, and they match the Greek stories in that they're dressed in black and they're out for vengeance, and they're totally badass. I was so stoked when they showed up. They initially show up at a gas station in episode 3. So if you haven't watched Chaos yet, obviously we're encouraging you to watch Chaos on our show here. We love it.
Sometimes in artwork, they are shown to have wings or bat wings to symbolize the swiftness of justice, which I think, bat wings translates well into leather jackets in this case. It's kind of a fun translation. Also also shown like often covered in blood in mythology, which they did not do in Chaos, and I think we're glad for that.
So bats, of course, are one of the symbols of the underworld because they're cavernous, right? Dark beings that we associate with the stalactites and the stalagmites in that imagery of the Greek underworld. And of course, the Furies live in the underworld. And in some sources, they're even said to be the children of Hades and Persephone.
In other sources, they are considered to be the children of Nyx. Also, in other sources, they are said to be one god, 3 women. A holy trinity.
Triple goddess. Interesting.
Triple goddess of vengeance. Also, interestingly enough, in some sources, the 3 of them, or one of them, is equated with a wrathful Demeter, who is sometimes given the epithet of Erinyes.
Erinyes is the Greek name for the Furies, and you're going to get a little etymology lesson with me today, per usual.
I was going to look it up, and then I was like, Randall will know. I'm not going to do that.
Randall will know. So there's a little bit of hazy origin for the word that Erinyes is based off of. One thought is it comes from the Greek erino, which means to hunt up or prosecute. Other scholars believe that it comes to us from the Arcadian eriniu, which means I am angry. So either way, it like really fits the vibe of what's going on here. Right? Yeah, like that anger personified, or like the hunting and prosecution of the criminals personified, which the Furies are absolutely both. And then of course, Fury comes to us from the Latin furere, which we still use today. It forms a root word for fury and for furious, and means angry. So we have really similar meanings in both. And then there's some fun little extra names that they have.
I was going to ask if you know the etymology of the Eumenides.
I do. So the Eumenides is kind of like, so in some texts, the Erinyes are called, or Furies are called Eumenides. And the Eumenides is basically like a Voldemort thing, where people were too scared to call the Erinyes by name. And so they called them this Greek word, which means well-meaning or soothed goddesses.
Basically, you spoke of dark powers with flattering words to try and ward off the power. And it's kind of like a, he who should not be named situation. You don't want to bring attention or offend. They were superstitious, not just superstitious.
Yeah, they're superstitious, not just a little stitious. In some sources, there's an unknown quantity of Furies, and in later sources, specifically in Virgil's Aeneid, there are 3 specific Furies, and that's how Chaos has chosen to present them. And that's what's most, I'd say, most commonly accepted these days when they're portrayed. And typically they were depicted as 3 maiden goddesses, like Caitlinn said, often with bat wings or snakes. So we talked about how Medusa is like unusual as being like the only snake-haired goddess. And I'm going to argue that that's still true, even with my research on the Furies, because the Furies have snakes woven into their hair to make them appear more terrible and terrifying. And they're also depicted with snakes like woven around their bodies. And as you see in this artwork behind me, This is the Pergamon altar that was initially constructed in what's now modern day Turkey, but you can find on display in Berlin. And this is what's believed to be an image of one of the Furies hurling a bowl of snakes at someone. So snakes were a powerful symbol of the Furies. And so they were depicted decorated with them.
Hurling bowls of snakes at people that I don't like. I don't know. Other sources say that they had snakes for hair and they cried or dripped blood from their eyeballs. So,
ooh, see, I read that they had red eyes and black robes.
yeah, often draped in black. But I mean, the thing about the Furies is that they are significantly older than any of the Greek pantheon. Like the mythology of the Furies, and even in terms of like Hesiod's Theogony, they are significantly older than the Olympian pantheon. And so, I mean, Randall and I have already mentioned there's like 8 different ways that people see them. You know, there's a million of them, or there's 3 of them, or there's 1 of them, or you know, they're maidens or they're consorts of Poseidon, or, you know, there's so many different interpretations of them because this is such an old myth.
Right. And most sources point to the Furies being like we talked about with the etymology coming to us from the Arcadians, which is one of the oldest ancient Greek tribes.
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes when we get these Arcadian linguistic pieces, that implies that these figures are coming to us from a much older tradition. We also see this with the Muses.
In Hesiod's Theogony, we get a little bit about the birth, if you will, of the Furies according to Greek mythology.
Let's hear it.
This is a story that's going to sound wildly familiar, I think, because it starts out like most of the stories that we have discussed, at least in terms of Zeus and Cronus. Cronus, his father, Uranus, he's often referred to just as the word heaven in a lot of these texts. The Greek word will translate directly into the word for sky, or capital H, heaven. So let's think back and remember that Zeus's father was Cronus. Cronus swallowed all of Zeus's siblings, and then Zeus rescued the other siblings that he had from Cronus's stomach, and that was Demeter and Hera and Poseidon and Hades. And so Cronus's father, Uranus, he was one of the oldest primordial figures that we have in Greek mythology, and his consort was Gaia, the earth. And so I really like the description of him as heaven coming down to lay with earth. I really think that's a beautiful description. However, he was a really gross guy. He was a really cruel father, and he felt incredibly stressed about the idea that his children were powerful and could possibly overthrow him. And so what he did was he imprisoned them within Gaia. So within the earth, he imprisoned his children because he was afraid that they were going to overthrow him. This pains Gaia, like it physically hurts her to have these children imprisoned within her. And so she says to her sons, this needs to end. Your father's a terrible dude. Let's do something about this. And they're all too afraid of Uranus to do anything, except for Cronus. Be he brave or be he opportunistic, he says to his mother, I'll deal with this. And so what Gaia does is she forms, I think the words are like a flint sickle. It's like a jagged sickle that she gives to Cronus. And when Uranus comes down to lay with Gaia, Cronus basically hacks off his father's ween, and the drops of the blood hit the earth. And it's those drops of blood entering the womb of Gaia from which the Furies are born. And there's a lot of ways to interpret this symbolism, but one that I really like is the idea that, 1, justice is older than the gods, but 2, the birth of the Furies was the symbolic establishment of cosmic order. So their birth kind of symbolized, you know, the initial, maybe order, codes, moral codes, cosmic codes, justice. They're typically a symbol of justice, whether positive or negative, they're a symbol of justice. So some have interpreted their birth as the original like birth of justice, which I think is fun.
And I think it's important to note as well that when Kronos castrated his father, one of the other drops of blood and along with his genitals landed in the ocean, and that mixed with the sea foam to produce Aphrodite.
So, Our Lady of Froth and Foam.
Right. And discarded genitals. So that's where like the goddess of love and
erotic,
romantic love. Yeah. I was going to say erotic, but of course we have Eros, and
that's fair,
which is where we get the word erotic. And Venus is the Roman name for Aphrodite. And that's where we get our word venereal.
Ooh. I'm so glad I know that now.
Right? A venereal disease is a disease you get from love making, the realm of Venus.
Thank you for clarifying that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. But this type of creation story is what's known as a secretion myth.
I hate that word. And I
officially called that. So
which makes sense, and it's fine. It's a fine word, but it feels a secretion myth. Really, we're gonna cut off some guy's peen and call it a secretion myth when children are birthed from the fallen testicle juice? Like, come on.
That's like literally what it means. Something secreted from the body, and now things come from that. And so typically this type of creation story is unintentional, right? It's different than like the Deuce Faber creation stories, which is like the intentional maker god who participates in the act of creation. But here we just see like the discharge and like the chaos and unintentionality of creation. And that completely changes the way that a culture sees themselves and their place in the world, right? If you believe that you were made intentionally by a divine being, perhaps in their image in some way, then that has the ability to inspire something different in a believer than if they believe that they just got here from some random chance of nothing, right? And we see this difference in ancient Greek mythology and Christianity, where in a lot of Christian stories, God is intentional, especially when he comes to earth as Jesus, right? He's intentional in the way that he's interacting with people. And the Greek gods, like mortals, are often just caught up in their bullshit, which is the Old Testament Christian God, right? I don't know. A lot going on.
I was going to say something naughty.
Say it.
Oh, it wasn't naughty. It was gross. You know, I honestly don't, when I hear the word secretion, I don't necessarily think like jizz or juice. I think like insects having mouth poison or like
like secreting a scent or something.
Yeah, like glands. You know, I don't
glands oozing.
Yeah, I really think of like bugs, not spiders, like actual like insects, like flies and stuff.
Thank you for clarifying that you are not talking about spiders. Real bugs, not those arachnids.
No, not spiders. I love. I mean, I like bugs in general, but
I don't like spiders and snakes, and that ain't what it takes to love me like I want you to.
So if I want you to love me, I shouldn't hurl bowls of snakes at you? Or will that work for me?
It would probably work.
If you're at a bar and a hot man hurled a bowl of snakes at you, what would it do for you?
Are they gummy snakes? And are they cold? Or are they room temperature?
They've been refrigerated.
I would happily receive a bowl of refrigerated gummy snakes thrown in my direction.
Take note, folks. Refrigerated bowl of gummy snakes is what does it for Randall.
Okay. So another thing that I think is really cool about the portrayal of the Furies in the show Chaos is that they were only visible to the people who they were pursuing. And that's part of the classic Greek stories about the Furies, is that one of the ways that they could seek justice upon a criminal is to drive them mad. And I love that they, in Chaos, like incorporated that element of what we today would define as madness, seeing things that other people can't see, right? And then when Ari was watching the TV, the Furies like changed the TV channel and were like really getting into her subconscious and making her crazy in that way. And that the hounds pursuing, like, it just brought this really cool, really visual element to the story of a person who looks like they're descending further and further into madness, because we as an audience are able to see the things that the people around them can't. And I liked that element of the storytelling advice that they brought in.
I really like that too. And I think for me, it really hit home because of what you said. The Furies are often seen, yeah, they torture people in Hades, but typically in the physical mortal realm, they're seen more so casting madness and insanity upon people as a punishment, psychological punishment, as opposed to physical punishment. There aren't a lot of actual stories of the Furies physically punishing living people, which is really interesting and why I appreciated what they did with Chaos. And also brings me to Aeschylus's Oresteia, which is a Greek tragedy written about the same time as the Homeric epics, so between 500 and 450 BCE, so that's before Common Era. It's a play, or a series of plays, and of course is a Greek tragedy, but it basically tells the story of, at the beginning of the Trojan War, one of the commanders, kings, Agamemnon, sacrificed his daughter, Iphigenia, to the gods in order to procure favorable winds. The story of the Oresteia is how Agamemnon returns home and his wife, Clytemnestra, murders him for murdering their daughter. And their son then retaliates by killing his mother, Clytemnestra. So it's a story of Orestes pursuing vengeance on his own. So the Furies throughout this play relentlessly pursue Orestes. They are seen psychologically tormenting him, basically. So they plague him with visions of themselves, these terrifying visions of themselves with snakes for hair and dripping blood, and they chase him across Greece, nearly driving him insane. And Orestes is unable to find peace because he's become consumed by such guilt and consumed by this mental torture that the Furies are putting upon him, that he starts to behave wildly and erratically. And it's interesting because the Furies are pretty hell-bent on punishing Orestes for taking matters into his own hands. They were known for punishing people who not only just wrongly shed blood, but in particular murdered family members was seen as a really big crime. And so they were seen as pursuers of justice in terms of familial law and moral codes. So we see here, they don't really care what Orestes' motivation was. They don't want to hear what he has to say about why he did what he did. It's interesting because at the end of the play, the Furies are persuaded to cease their pursuit of Orestes when he is acquitted by a council headed by the goddess Athena. The verdict calms the anger of the Furies, and here we see in this play their name is changed to the Eumenides, which Randall described earlier as the soothed ones, which I think is a really interesting, like, in my opinion, because typically the Furies are seen as goddesses of wrath and this harsh punishment and vengeance, and they keep social norms and values by ensuring crimes were met with appropriate consequences. And so here it's interesting that they are changed to something else. In this case, I think it's supposed to show the balance between justice and mercy, and how the power of reconciliation and healing is a really important part of justice. However, I think that was a very political motive. I think that Aeschylus was trying to basically bring about a new era of Rome where he was dismissing old norms of justice and trying to institute a new philosophical movement of justice, which was more oriented towards mercy and reconciliation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an interesting way to basically have a society move on to a different era of its own development. The Furies represented like an old paradigm of justice.
Yes, and what I think is really unique about the way that the Furies dole out justice is that it could be done at an individual level or at a societal level, right? And so the Furies could punish an entire community for harboring a criminal or for perhaps like glorifying criminal behavior or tendencies. And so everybody would suffer, right? If there was a drought and the crops wouldn't grow or whatever it is, and it's divine punishment from the Furies, that then specific like rituals or rites would have to be performed in order to stop the punishment. But of course, like there has to be that level of accountability and willingness to modify behavior. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that like just performing a ritual and then continuing to go about your criminal behavior is any way to get the Furies off your back, right? And like what I love about the way that Chaos personified the Furies is that Ari says in episode 5 that the Furies intentionally make people lose faith in everything they know and love until they eventually just kill themselves because they've been driven so insane by that. They've been driven to madness. And I love that the cause of madness from the Furies is social isolation, right? And like we still have that same punishment that we inflict in our penal system today, right? Like social isolation is the worst of the worst, solitary confinement. And that's what the Furies would do to a person.
I also think another way to interpret it is that there are repercussions to violence in another sense, which is that internal psychological torment that comes from knowing what the moral codes are and acting against them, right? So knowing that, murder is frowned upon and killing your mom anyway. I would hope you would have some sort of psychological torment as a result of that.
So when I was reading about that, I was thinking of the Amityville Horror. You know that movie?
Book. I mean, I know it, but I've not seen it.
The idea is
weird.
that like there's something in the house that drives this person mad and they kill their whole family. Or like The Shining, like there are so many different novels and movies that explore this idea of going crazy and then turning it on your family and killing your family. And then that person, spoiler alert for most of these horror movies, is that person then kills themselves or finds their demise in some way through their descent into madness, but they take their family with them along the way. And that would be the realm of the Furies in Greek mythology. Gosh, what a fun mashup. But I would like to note that even in Emily Wilson's translation of Homer's Iliad, she uses the word Furies to name them instead of the Erinyes.
Yeah, I've actually looked through all of my versions of the Iliad today, and almost all of them call them the Furies. I think the Furies in the Iliad is a really interesting concept because within Homer's Iliad, they are invoked rather than personified. Like they're a symbolic reference. There's, I think, 3 main places where the actual words the Furies are used in the text in books 9, 19, and 21. And one of them is
book 9 right now.
Is that where Nestor warns Achilles of the wrath of the Furies if he disrespects his elders? So he's invoking the Furies as the protector of familial and societal order. Nestor in his conversation with Achilles. In book 19, Agamemnon calls on the Furies as witnesses to corroborate that he did not touch Briseis, which is really interesting because the Furies were also seen as overseers and protectors of oaths. They would punish oath breakers. And so when Agamemnon calls on the Furies, I'm calling on the Furies to say I did not touch this woman, he's basically not only reinforcing the gravity of his oath and appealing to their role as enforcers of divine and moral law, But he's also saying, like, if I lie, I risk the wrath of the Furies, right? So that was a really big way to, like, reinforce that you were telling the truth. Because if you called on the Furies and then didn't tell the truth, well, shit, man, you're kind of like, you just fucked yourself over.
Yeah, you don't want to risk that.
No.
Yowza.
And then one of the other interesting places that the Furies are mentioned in the Iliad is Achilles goes on this killing spree, and he makes one of the rivers on the battlefield really angry because he desecrates the river's waters with all these corpses of the people he's just rampage killed. And so it is really gross. So the river calls on the Furies because he's mad at Achilles. But even if they don't actively appear, which they don't in the Iliad, their symbolic presence or the threat of their presence, whether or not they showed up, the Furies as a symbol represented the inevitability of consequences to wicked actions.
Regular folks could also call on the Furies to punish criminals as well. I just love this idea that these three gals are hanging out in the underworld and like inflicting torture in Tartarus, and then they fly up to Earth when they've been summoned and dish out some divine justice with their leathery wings of a bat. And they drag people. I mean, do they drag people back to the underworld specifically? I don't think they're really necessarily like capturing the souls and bringing them back with them. But once they have come to the underworld and it's been determined through their judgment that they need divine retribution, when they come to the like fact that they need this divine retribution, like then they're the ones who are enacting it.
I like to see them as these like badass witches who are like, you know, they're torturing people in Hades. I like the word ascend because it makes it's like a parallel to Jesus' ascension to heaven in my mind, is the Furies ascending from the depths of Hades to the mortal realm. I like to see it as them being like, curse you, curse your mom, curse your community, see you later, and then like leave these people to shrivel up, left to their own like psychological damaging resources, and then they're like, oh, it's you again. Finally you made it. Welcome to Tartarus. I think the Furies are fun. I like the idea of these like three badass women who are just doling out shit for like wicked crimes. You know, like the importance of moral responsibility, the need for an atonement. I like the idea that they're holding people who are violent accountable, like requiring people to face their fucking wrongs, meet it head on, and like holding this balance between right and wrong and being these guardians of truth who are like really just, but also emotional enough that they cry at Orpheus's song when he plays begging to Hades to let Eurydice go. However, they are overwhelmingly these harsh figures. They refused to hear why Orestes killed his mom. They weren't super concerned with people's motives, which is a whole separate conversation, but it does make them seem cruel, and sometimes that they punish just for punishment's sake without even considering the possibilities for reconciliation and unity. Like there's a lack of mercy and forgiveness, and I know that's like my pacifistic self like projecting that those are valid and valuable pieces of information, but that's what I'm saying. My own personal struggle with, I love these badass women, but I also like think that from my perspective where I sit now, their chaos kind of leads to more chaos. Hammurabi's code isn't how we do justice anymore for a reason, right? Because an eye for an eye and the whole world cannot see with their eyeballs anymore. You know, like by relentlessly pursuing their victims, they almost like keep destabilizing families and destabilizing communities and prolonging the violence. And I know I've said this before and we don't need to get into it, but I am a pacifist and I don't think violence solves problems. And I think if you solve problems using violence, you just create the pattern for more violence. And so I go back and forth between loving the idea of these powerful women holding, you know, murderers accountable, but also Randall's talking about a drought affecting a whole community. Like, what the fuck did those kids do?
Right. It's indiscriminate punishment, which is problematic and doesn't align with our modern day ethics, for sure.
Exactly. So In context, I imagine they were more like neutral. You know, the idea of justice is neutral and primordial and older than the gods and humans and all that kind of stuff. But I'm a little bit of a tender heart, so I don't like the idea of
You
hurting
mean your
more
tender
people.
heart tends to start to bleed. Don't be offended by my frank analysis. Think of it as personality dialysis. So you bring up a good point about justice being primordial and ancient and like predating humans and society and even the gods, right? And we see these Furies as predating the Greek gods, which is amazing. But also it begs the question for me, like, can anyone control the Furies, or are they like the Fates, in that idea that these three women, like the Fates, don't necessarily control fate, but they manage it and they communicate it in the same way the Furies aren't deciding what is right or wrong. They're just carrying out the retribution for crimes. But like, who determines what a crime is? Who's in charge here? Like, the mythology tells us that it's not Zeus, right? Even though he's the king of the gods, that the Furies are operating independently of that hierarchical structure of either gods or kings, gods on Mount Olympus or kings on earth. But sometimes they work for Hades, or they just work in the underworld.
I got the sense they were like the crazy ants that everybody kind of just like lets them do their own thing, but nope, you know, like
I like that. I like that interpretation.
I didn't take away that Hades or Zeus was like telling them what to do, or
right? Like, I don't think Hades is necessarily determining. It's this idea of divine justice.
for me, and maybe this is not as related as I think it is in my head. I think part of my own personal modern issue with understanding the Furies and this idea of justice that happens is like, how are we defining justice? How are they defining justice? Justice is a social construct that is very much defined by whatever culture you grew up in and your own personal response to the culture you grew up in and the communal response to the culture you grow up in.
I mean, the idea of justice is that everybody's treated fairly, right? But then if we zoom out, then we get to this broader question of what is fairness, right? Is fairness equality, where everybody is treated equally, regardless of extenuating factors or circumstances? Or is fairness equity, where those variables and differences are accounted for, right? And we have this, the best illustration I've seen of this is the lining up of people at a fence. So like, there's a baseball game and there's a fence in the way, and you have three people, and equality would say they each get one box to stand on, but they're different heights. And so one box for each of them means that the tallest person can still see over the fence, the medium person can barely see over the fence, and the shortest person still can't see. But an equitable approach would be a fair distribution of resources, to where the shortest person would get the most scaffolding and the tallest person wouldn't need any scaffolding at all. But then what's the third option is just removing the barrier altogether, right? And so there is no fence, so nobody needs any accommodations. And so it's such a complicated question with so many factors, because then we have to define as well, what is a crime and who is a criminal and who is worthy of that label. And philosophically, we can ask the question, like, in our society, or we can make the argument that in our society, criminality is based on where you fit into the social hierarchy.
Greco-Roman society is technically the bedrock of Western civilization in terms of thinking and philosophy, right? Like, we definitely,
Absolutely.
like, our school system still is very Aristotle flavored. And, you know, just in terms of laying it out philosophically, right? Like, most of our society today is founded upon the bedrock of most of these Greco-Roman philosophers. And Greco-Roman deities are Western deities. And so we tend to understand them more than we would other deities from other cultures who have different functions, right?
right? I mean, look at our incoming president here in the United States, right? He is
What
a
a guy.
convicted felon, yet he's still eligible to hold the highest office in our country. The difference of if you were a cashier and your employer shorts your paycheck $100, is there any retribution? Can you call the police? Can you have that remedied? No, you can't call the police for something like that. You'd have to get a lawyer and go through like multiple rounds of different things, and it would cost you more than you would be getting back. And so most people don't pursue it. But if you as the cashier walked out of that store with $100 from the till in your pocket, that storekeeper could call the police and have you arrested and use city public resources in order to pursue criminal charges against you, when us as individuals don't have that same ability. And the crime is the same, the theft of $100, but the recipient of the crime is different, right? And so it just like, we in the United States today, our criminal system sees individual businesses and larger like conglomerate corporations as individual entities who can be stolen from, right? And it's all about the power structure and the power dynamic and who holds that social currency. So it's just such a complex, complicated question. Like you were saying earlier, the way that the Furies are portrayed as these like badass women is super great for women, but like once again we're seeing this elevation of patriarchal constructs, essentially, where we're putting women in positions of power just to fuck up other women. And it's hard to watch and it's disappointing, and it goes against what we today understand to be femininity and the female divine and the power of creation of femininity, when the Furies represent kind of this like destruction of self instead of this individuation process. And that's kind of hard to witness.
It is. It to me almost feels like, and you can push back on this always, but to me it feels like they're, these powerful women that are using patriarchal power. And you've said it, I think maybe in one of our first episodes, or maybe the Hera episode, I don't want to live in a society like that. I don't want to live in a society where I'm lauded for, being in community with other women who just use our power to hurt other people, because that's the patriarchy. That is internalized patriarchy, and that's me using my privilege as a white woman to internalize that patriarchy and not actually be a feminist, right? Like, that's not inclusive.
Yeah, it's this proximity to power and power within the patriarchal structure, and the idea of punishment. Like, as hippy dippy flower children feminist pacifists, the two of us don't really love punishment, right? Like, I believe in rehabilitation, and I don't believe that punishment leads to rehabilitation.
No,
punishment leads to more anger, and anger begets anger, and anger begets violence, and it just creates this fucking negative feedback loop. And that's not what I want to see. That's not the society that I want to build. And can we separate the Furies from this idea? Can we turn the Furies into some like, this is what I would love to see, some like Dexter type story where the Furies are out here like only carrying out their swift divine justice on sex offenders and murderers. It's Law and Order SVU, the Furies. Sexual crimes are considered especially heinous, and that's when the Furies come in.
Bum, bum.
And then they're like flying in on their bat wings
with blood pouring from their eyes. Would Ice T be in it though?
Yeah, who else would like be like, yo, Furies, I think that criminal went that way, and then he's got to flip his braid.
What about Stapler? Do we miss Stapler, or do we?
I think he looks like a husky.
I think he looks like my childhood best friend, and it's like, I'll have to send you a picture.
It's like his cul-de-sacs and his piercing eyes. Like, he looks very husky adjacent.
Interesting.
Not husky like large, like husky like a dog.
Yeah, I knew what you meant. Okay.
Yow. we mentioned that the Furies have a specific like vengeance towards family on family crime. And also the crimes they punish are disobedience towards parents, violation of parental respect due to old age, perjury, murder, and very specifically, violations of the law of hospitality. So I ask you the question, was it the Furies who destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah?
Oh, shit. Bruh, you need to warn me before you drop that.
I will not warn you. Boom, shakalaka.
You know how I usually think of Sodom and Gomorrah?
Butt stuff. What?
No, I mean, no, I don't usually think of Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, okay. Well,
Yeah, you do.
First of all, I don't understand why butt stuff is such a big deal. Like, come on, man. Okay, well, I think in my perspective,
sodomy, it's between God and me.
Modern evangelical Christians or Protestants like to pick stories out of the Bible and just like remove it and like let's dissect this little piece without reading like the whole fucking historical context, right? Or at least even the whole like arc in the Bible. So what you see in Genesis is literally, you know, God's commanded the Israelites to be fruitful and multiply. And then a few sections later, that's when the condemnation comes, probably because God had just commanded them to be fruitful and multiply, right? So that would have been seen as selfish to pursue.
God is condemning the wasting of the seed, the spilling of the seed without the potential for procreation. So he's talking about masturbation. He's talking about straight sex where you give her a pearl necklace. He is talking about sodomy. He's talking about any sexual act that does not end in potential procreation,
right?
Because that's a waste of resources.
Okay.
Back to the original question.
No,
Do you think that the Furies destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for the crime of being inhospitable to guests? Because one of the Furies' main functions was specifically to punish those who violate the laws of hospitality.
The reason I was telling this backstory is because we often assume that Sodom and Gomorrah is just being punished for whatever happened in, I think it's Genesis 19 is the biblical verse, and that's it, right? But there's a lot of other things biblically that are happening, including, but not limited to, a flood, a global deluge, right? Like there's a lot of other like natural disasters that we're trying to solve in our time, right? And they're, in my mind, someone either like arsoned Sodom and Gomorrah, or what if it was like a meteor or some shit? What if they were like, oh, a meteor fell on the city and set shit on fire, it must be God's divine punishment? That was a long way to say I don't know.
Because essentially the cities are destroyed because of their sins. And it just struck me that this idea that the Furies can do more, their powers extend beyond just driving individuals, mortals to madness, but they could punish societies. And I mean, even look at the story of Joseph and what was Pharaoh doing and how was Pharaoh behaving in order to receive this divine retribution, right? If we're looking at it from a Greek perspective, then it would be the Furies who are carrying these things out, perhaps, like on a societal scale.
Yeah, but my pushback on that would be most of these gods were confined to their national borders. So the Hebrew people wouldn't necessarily have believed in the Greco-Roman divinities, nor would they Greco-Roman divinities necessarily have left Greece. Like there wasn't the idea of gods traveling between nations necessarily.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Would it have been the Furies? Probably not. Would it have been Yahweh according to them? Yes. Would Yahweh have smote Greece? Probably not. Would God smite Greece? Probably yes, because Christians are a very, very global religion, right? Very colonial religion. Ancient Greco-Romans, not so much.
I would argue that the Romans were absolutely colonial.
Oh, sure. But yeah, they're like the original colonizers.
Yeah. But their particular brand of colonialism wasn't do things our way or die. It was like, this is our land now, bye. Now you're under Rome, but that you can still practice all your things. You don't have to convert.
That's what they weren't like, we're going to take the Greek gods to like the Druids. No, they were just like, we'll kill the Druids if they don't want to live under our rule, right? Like, and if they do, like, fine. I don't know. It's a good... I don't usually cross-pollinate like that.
I don't mean, do the Hebrews believe in the Furies? I mean, like, do you think that this function, if this was a Greek story, would that function have been carried out by the Furies, right?
Oh,
in a similar way that the angels are
My
carrying
specific
out
brand
that.
of autism did not hear the question
Took
like
it
that.
very literally.
Well, I don't know. What do you think? That seems like...
I think it's interesting because it wasn't God himself who punished Sodom and Gomorrah. It was the angels' interpretation of what was happening there, and the angels witnessed it, and the angels were like, oh, now God's got to ruin it.
The angels were specifically commanded by God to be the harbingers of God's wrath in Sodom and Gomorrah. So there was an actual conversation between like Abraham and God where in the chapter before, where God's like willing to spare Sodom and Gomorrah if Abraham can find like even one worthy human being. And there is none. So then the angels show up.
But they were the harbingers of all of it, right? From my understanding of the story. Like, they were the agents of divine justice, essentially.
Sure.
They were functioning as agents of divine justice and punishing an entire society, like, for violating the laws of hospitality.
My question is, do we have any stories where the Furies behave like that and smite on that level or curse on that level? Do you know?
In the Aeneid, maybe? In the Aeschylus play, the Eumenides, there's a part where the Erinyes, the Furies, threaten to torment all of the inhabitants of Athens and to poison the surrounding countryside. Athena then breaks in because she is committed specifically to
She's the head of the council or whatever.
Right, but she's committed to justice, not just vengeance. And the Furies are seen as part of that vengeance.
Right.
Yeah. So we have that.
I was thinking about, because I did read that part of it this morning, where Athena is talking in that council, that, you know, how we talk about the gods being the personifications and the dramatizations of really specific aspects of human beings. This all, Athena and the Furies made me think of the Hindu goddess Kalima. She's kind of like an integrated version of Athena and the Furies, right? Like, she's both destruction and death as well as creation and salvation. She is both vicious and nurturing. She kills what stands in the way of human peace, and she's wrathful and often depicted with a crazed face and unruly hair, but she also in that is like the embodiment of the cycles of nature, which we've talked about before. You know, we can't put value judgments on them because they just are. Birth, death, rebirth. You can't put a value judgment on a tornado because it's not, I mean, bad things happen, sure, like destruction happens,
but that's the chaos of it, right? But if a person called upon the Furies to punish the city that they're living in, and then the tornado is that agent of destruction, like, that changes things, that right? Like, the intentionality changes things. Absolutely.
I don't want to be the kind of person that prays for a tornado to happen to people.
Yeah, no, I don't either. So we could say, you know, good job, Furies, for prospering in a male-dominated field. And also, we wish that field didn't exist.
I am, like, stuck in existential mode right now. I'm just like, shit is happening in my brain.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, on this episode of The Mything Link.
I'm Randall.
I'm Caitlin.
And we will see you next week. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlin Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlin Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective Incorporated, a humanities